The assumption is that learning equals earning, that graduates will earn a lot more than non-graduates. As soon as you start to disaggregate, to not just take all non-graduates and all graduates and lump them together, but we start to separate them out, really it's only the top 20% of graduates who've really seen a very significant increase in their graduate premium. And we see that top end pulls away from the rest. The assumption was that graduates would be able to pay back their loans without too much difficulty because they were all going to be in knowledge-based jobs and they were going to be paid lots of money. That was always a fallacy. And now we're left with billions in debt, a debt we don't know what to do with as a nation. The assumptions that were made about the expectations of what a degree was going to offer you, for many graduates, is not being realized.
Welcome to the Work for Humans podcast. This is Dart Lindsley. In past episodes, I've used the term human capital as an example of treating people like factors of production. Recently, however, I've learned that the origin of this idea was developed to disrupt the notion of people as inputs to production. Instead, human capital theory argues that knowledge and skill will increase economic output and worker earnings. Fast forward to today, hundreds of thousands of college graduates are promised that more learning means more earning. But they're now facing a harsh new reality. AI, outsourcing, a shifting economy have created an oversupply of educated workers, leading to widespread feelings of betrayal and crushing student debt. Human capital theory is not delivering on its promise. Phillip Brown, a sociologist, author, and distinguished research professor at Cardiff University, is on a mission to redefine human capital in an age of new technology and limited quality jobs. He's authored 17 books and more than 100 publications, critically examining the relationship between education, social mobility, and economic inequality on a global scale. In his latest book, The Death of Human Capital, he calls for a new paradigm to rethink how we view labor supply, demand, and returns. In this episode, Phil and I talk about the rise and false promise of human capital theory, outsourcing knowledge work, and the impact of AI. We also discuss an oversupply of graduates and an undersupply of quality jobs, the new paradigm to replace human capital theory, rethinking labor supply and returns, and other topics. All right, if you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe to support Work for Humans. Without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Phillip Brown. Phil Brown, welcome to Work for Humans.
Dart, it's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
So those of us in the business of employee experience and working in HR, we throw around the word human capital all the time. In fact, the systems that we use are called HCMs, human capital management systems. And that's how we run companies. And I realized reading your work that I've never really understood the origins of that. And I've never really understood that it was once considered a remedy to the idea that people are a factor of production, because to me it sounds just exactly like treating people like a factor of production. And you've written numerous books, one of the most recent of which is The Death of Human Capital, which takes on the economic philosophy underlying the term. And so I really am excited to talk to you about the history of that term, what's wrong with it, and what the solutions are. So let's start with the source of it, where it came from, what was the context?
Yeah, we all use the term in our everyday conversations, and we all think we know what it means. If you think about companies, but you think also about policymakers and our government, a lot of their thinking around education is driven by some idea of human capital. So what does that mean and where does it come from? Well, actually, the term didn't really become particularly popular or well known until the 1960s. And Theodore Schultz gave a economics society lecture where he introduced the notion of human capital, which was literally the idea that actually humans are a crucial source of productivity. But actually, it's an old idea rather than a new one. And if you go back to Adam Smith, he talks about a detailed division of labor and actually the role of human labor within that. But what he had in mind was such a specialized view of work, and he uses the idea of course, pin manufacturing, which was so broken down that no human skill or knowledge was really required. So for him, education was a compensation from work. Whereas what we see throughout the early stages of the 20th century is this growing recognition that our skills and knowledge are becoming more and more important to productive activity. And this was really crystallized in the 1960s by American economists at Chicago.
What I never understood before reading your books is that Schultz was saying, look, we have to get away from thinking of people as a factor of production and start thinking of them as human capital. And that whole phrase just didn't even make any sense to me because I thought human capital meant factor of production. But what I realized in reading your book is that prior to that, labor was considered so fungible. In fact, some of them, I can't remember who it was, it might have been Smith, who referred to people working in a factory line as beasts. It's just this idea that the idea of factor of production is it's like a commodity. It's like a raw material, and that quality doesn't matter, and that the content of the person's mind doesn't matter. And that after this framing of human capital, it's saying, no, humans are a reservoir of value that can be increased.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is that accurate?
It is accurate. In those early decades, especially by the 1950s, there was recognition that they couldn't explain productivity growth. And so increasingly it was seen to be an issue of skill, something that human beings bring to the productive process. So in a sense, they stopped treating humans like, if you like, lumps of coal. You know, the more coal you add to the fire, then the more heat you generate. So the idea was that actually, if you begin to have a workforce which has some basic rudimentary literacy and numeracy, then that would start to contribute to productivity. So that's where the ideas slowly began to emerge. Now, you raise a really interesting question about whether we've actually moved away from humans as being a factor of production. Because just because you talk about human capital doesn't mean that you really are talking about humans and their relationship to capital. You can start to treat humans as capital. So there's two quite different ways of thinking about it, I would say. I'm not sure that we made much advance in actually seeing humans as bundle of skills or bundles of capabilities. I actually think that current debates around skill and agile working is actually the reproduction of those same ideas of treating individuals like a bundle of skills, and the attempt is to then unbundle that. So I think that the idea of human capital, meaning that we're going to treat humans as humans within work and not simply as a resource, is not necessarily the case.
One of the things you wrote is, it's extraordinary that an economic theory with human in its title has so little to say about what makes us human or about differences in human aspirations, motivations, and identities. And so it may not be treating people like coal, but it is still treating people as, for one thing, and I think Schultz actually, I don't know if he said this or if it was said about him, but that the value of labor is entirely its productive capacity. And so very, very narrowly focused on what you can produce as your value.
Absolutely. And when you think about the education system and the relationship between then education and work, and the idea then that education becomes not about consumption, which was actually seen about the development of individuals as individuals and their interests that they might have, to the idea of education around their investment value as potential productive labor, you see how over time that's become so ingrained in our way of thinking about education. We barely question that. And you see massive, massive expansion of education at the tertiary level during the last 30 years or so. but this started back in the 60s, last 20, 30 years, to the point where the assumption is that learning equals earning, that you get the credentials, you get the skills that employers want, and then you apply that in the workplace. That's been a major assumption and a major fault line, I would argue, in terms of our thinking about education and work over the last 20, 30 years.
What was the promise of human capital theory? What did it argue it was going to produce in terms of value?
I think that Schultz argued that human capital recognized a new form of capitalism where more of the value would be in human labor rather than simply those who own the means of production. So education was then seen as the investment vehicle for enabling individuals to develop their own skills, so develop their own form of capital, if you like, which they could then sell in the marketplace. At the same time, if governments invested in individuals on a huge level across the society, it could create economic growth and prosperity for individuals, and crucially, some idea of fairness, that people get rewarded for what they contribute, for their abilities and efforts and skills, and not just because of who they know or what background they come from or what gender they are.
There's some underlying things there. And I want to get into the ways in which that promise has not materialized. But one of the things that seems very fundamental to that idea, and perhaps very appealing to that idea, is that if we are all in charge of manufacturing ourselves to be useful inputs to production, then the locus of accountability or the locus of control is entirely in the individual, as opposed to being in the system and the nature of the system in which the individual is existing. And so it's very appealing because if you're in charge of making you a useful input to production, then I'm not in charge of making a world in which you can thrive because it's all on you.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that that's wrong. I'm not saying that it's not up to people. I'm just saying that it's not entirely up to people, the outcomes of their future. There's a context in which, and a system in which we are existing that determines a lot of our outcomes.
If you think about when the idea of human capital became popular in the 1960s, that was a time of very significant kind of state intervention in everyday life and industrial organization, in education, with an emphasis upon extending opportunities for individuals. So the institutional, governmental role was seen to be very significant. Now, what changed was that when we had the shift towards neoliberalism, human capital became much more important because it offered a theory of precisely what you describe, of individual responsibility. So you're in charge of your own fate. So we will simply give you a chance to develop those skills, to develop those credentials in increasingly a market competition in relation to education as well as the labor market. But you are responsible, but it's not a big problem because the assumption was the world of work was itself changing. That actually the big problem, there wasn't sufficient supply of talent and of technical, professional, and managerial skills to actually deliver what the economy required. The arguments around globalization that we then saw under Clinton and Blair in the UK accelerated also that thinking that we were now in a global knowledge economy, that technologies were becoming so complex that the key to our economic prosperity as an individual and also as a society is what's in people's heads. So we started even measuring the numbers of people or the proportions of people in higher education as an indicator of your economic competitiveness as a nation. So the whole thing was hanging around this idea that the economy was changing and opportunities were there. So it was a question of education, if you like, in a race to catch up with the labour market opportunities. Now, if you think, as I do, that that was never a reality, and if you think that new technologies and especially around that generative AI and such things, are actually posing even more of a challenge to knowledge forms of work, then that whole set of assumptions about human capital and about the role of individuals creating their own destiny becomes even more of a problem. And much of the strife and unraveling that we're seeing today in that relationship in education, jobs, rewards, the cost of living crisis, now at the middle of the labour market, not just at the lower end, is, in my view, all about this set of assumptions in a way around human capital. So the opportunity bargain that has been sold for a very long time has been unraveling very significantly. And governments are very reluctant to challenge that because what else do they do? What new thinking have they done around education? What new thinking have they done around the labour market? What new thinking is really taking place in the nature of work? How are organisations really using those technologies? Are these the things that can create a new bargain? Currently, they're not.
And underlying the theory of human capital is an idea that if we create a supply of educated people, it will create demand for those educated people. And I'm really surprised that nobody noticed that that was something that was debunked, at least in big chunks of the economy, by Keynes. I think it was Say's law, right? Which said that if you create supply of products, it will create demand. And Keynes said, then no, that's not true. Sometimes you have to goose demand to make that true. But the exact same fallacy appeared in the case of the workforce, in the case of labor.
Exactly. And I'll make a distinction between the work of Schultz, actually, and of Gary Becker. Gary Becker came afterwards, and all the caveats that you can see in Schultz's work were taken out. And then Becker presents a general theory. And at the heart of that general theory is that you can describe the labour market and the nature of work by the supply. So precisely what you're saying. So the assumption was you create an educated workforce, so-called educated or well-qualified workforce, and that the jobs will follow. Now, that ran into trouble reasonably early on, but then we had the idea of skill-biased technological change, which was on the demand side. So they picked up on the idea that actually technology is skill-biased, that it demands higher levels of skill from the workforce, and therefore, although Becker was wrong, human capital, in a sense, is right, because actually the demand is there for this kind of labour. Now, both of those are in fundamental trouble today, and this is why we need a fundamental rethink.
So let's talk about the nature of the trouble. What is the evidence that human capital theory is not working?
The evidence we tend to draw on, and we do tend to draw more on the quantitative data, primarily because a lot of the assumptions about human capital and its rate of return is based upon a kind of education and what people with different kinds of education will basically later on be earning. So whether it's lifetime earnings or a snapshot of the actual wage distribution at a particular time. The assumption is that learning equals earning, so that graduates will earn a lot more than non-graduates. And what they tend to focus on are averages and sometimes means, but usually averages, so that you take the average non-graduate and you compare it with the average graduate. Now, if you just have that, then you see some difference, although the differences have not been as great as was commonly assumed. But as soon as you start to disaggregate, so we start to not just take all non-graduates and all graduates and lump them together, but we start to separate them out. And then what we find from that, for example, is that really it's only the top 20 odd % of graduates who've really seen a very significant increase in their graduate premium. And when you compare this with the non-graduates, then you see that some of those are earning more than the median or average graduates. So it's a very, very mixed picture. And that mixed picture reflects the changing nature of work. And I'm sure we'll probably come on to it. But for me, it reflects some of the ways in which companies are engaged with talent management, that with the idea of a war for talent, more emphasis is placed at the top end. So you want to pick your high potentials. Where do the high potentials come from? They come from more elite universities. They have certain kinds of characteristics which is seen to be potential. So then they invest in that potential, and we see that top end pulls away from the rest. But for many other graduates, the rate of return is actually not very good at all. And when you have to look at the degrees of student debt, like in the UK, which is absolutely unbelievable, and the US, obviously the figure is much, much larger, but also hugely problematic. And in the UK, the assumption was that graduates would be able to pay back their loans without too much difficulty because they were all going to be in knowledge-based jobs and they were going to be paid lots of money. That was always a fallacy. And now we're left with billions in debt, a debt we don't know what to do with as a nation. And they're just examples. I mean, there's obviously lots of examples about underemployment, about graduates being in non-graduate jobs, for example. I mean, one of the interesting features of this is that if you look at the middle of the labor market or middle earners, and if we think about middle earners as those 75% to 150% of the median, then we see, like in the UK, the figure has gone, I think, from 19 to 47% are now graduates in the middle. And in the US, the figures are slightly different. In the US, the figures really are from 10% to 35%. This is from 2001 to 2021. So we're seeing more and more graduates in the middle of the labor market earning middle-level incomes. So the assumptions that were made about the expectations of what a degree was going to offer you, for many graduates, is not being realized.
Yeah, there was one graph that I really wanted to dive into. It basically shows the average income based upon education quality, I'm going to say, and then those who are non-graduates. And there's one line at the top, and it's referred to as high quality education.
It refers to income. The high, medium, and low refers to income levels, not status of the university.
Okay, that makes sense to me. So basically what you were doing, you were disaggregating, saying, look, you have to look not just at the average of the whole, you have to disaggregate it and look at the full range.
Yeah. That's
Okay.
so apologies for any confusion from that. But yeah, so the high, medium, and low is about income rather than about the status of the institution. However, of course, you can
Yes.
you can easily see the relationship between the status hierarchy of universities and the opportunities within the labor market, and that both the universities and the companies are guilty here because the universities will themselves sell themselves as being world-class, of having the best faculty, of having the best students, and therefore the idea being the most productive students. Come to us if you want talent. And the companies that want to be seen to hire the best. You know, if you're a consultancy company and you're going to charge large fees, you want to be able to say that you're hiring the best of the best. So this correspondence, if you like, between the universities and the employers is something that fundamentally needs to be challenged. And a lot of people have tried to challenge it, but it's very, very hard to really see how that can be broken. But it needs to be broken.
I've seen it in action, and some of it's just a practical thing, which is you're doing college recruiting, university recruiting, and you can't go to every university in the world. You just can't. You just don't have the scale. And so particularly top companies go to the most famous universities and recruit there. And so the number of opportunities, if you're at a Carnegie Mellon, if you're in a technical person or one of the other big schools, is just much higher. And I also suspect that there's an instability in the sense that opportunity stacks on opportunity, which is if you get a little bit of opportunity, you're going to get a little more opportunity. And in that new opportunity, you're going to get more learning. And then there's more opportunities. So it's like playtime in sports. So I can see how results can diverge when you look at it in a more disaggregated way, because those who get more playtime get more playtime.
Yeah. But I think there's an important thing here in terms of opportunity and social inclusion. because when I think about my own background, I left school at 16 with virtually no qualifications and went to do an apprenticeship with British Leyland, which was a big car manufacturer at the time in the UK. And I realized it was pretty dull and I wanted to get out. So then I went to night school, which was a real slog. So I thought I'd be a youth worker. And there was only a couple of places in the UK that would take you under the age of 20 to be a youth worker. Anyway, I enjoyed
What's a youth worker?
A youth worker, somebody works with young people in a youth centre. So it's separate from school, but there are kind of centres for young people. So it's more of a kind of adult environment. And it was also related to community work as well. So when I started doing the academic work, then I realised I really quite enjoyed it and was able then to go and do a PhD. And so at each stage, from starting from a pretty low base, each stage there was a new opportunity. But what came with the opportunity was a different understanding. Because when I was 16, I don't think I'd ever properly met a graduate. But as I then spent some time with graduates, I realised, well, actually, maybe they're not quite as good as I thought they were. Or maybe I'm slightly better than I thought I was. And each incremental stage, up to professor and beyond, has been the same thing. And there's a very famous professor at Oxford, who's no longer with us, unfortunately, A.H. Halsey, who also comes from a working class background. And we would share these stories about how our discovery of mediocrity, it's not that they were mediocre, it's just that we underestimated ourselves. So those incremental opportunities you're talking about really matter for individuals, and finding ways of giving more individuals that chance to have that next opportunity is really important. So one of the issues for us today is how do we maintain social mobility? Because those opportunities become crucial. And a lot of those are through the workplace. And if they stop being available, then that is going to cause a lot of difficulties for people to make that progression.
And so you've described a state in which we have massively overproduced university graduates into a market that cannot absorb that capacity. This creates an incredibly dangerous situation in which some large proportion of the population feels betrayed by the economy, that they were told that if they went X number of dollars in debt in their student loans, that they would make an income, and they get that out there onto the job market and they find nothing. And if you go into the comments on almost any discussion of work online, you find people saying, look, I'm $50,000 in debt, and I simply cannot get a job that can pay off my debt. Did the data support that?
I think it does. And I think it's been very interesting it's a very difficult situation, but it's interesting to see, just with the cost of living crisis, how many people now are in even steady jobs who simply can't afford their electricity bills, plus their rents, let alone the possibility of buying property, with not just one income, with a household income, with two incomes, potentially. So I think there's a real issue there. But I think one point I'd like to pick up, if I may, and that is that there has been an oversupply, but the oversupply is because the very language we're using of oversupply is the language of human capital. So it's an oversupply if you think the only purpose of education is about preparing people for their jobs and about their economic welfare. Now, of course, that is a very important part of education, but it's clearly not the only purpose. So the question, in a way, is then, what is the purpose of education and higher education? And what's the point of all this competition early on in the school process to get your credentials that will get you into universities? Well, of course, there's a huge push to do that, precisely because, as we've already said, at the top end, you can still do really well. So that the positional competition for that top end, so the best schools, the best prep schools, the best colleges, the best universities, intensifies very significantly. So despite what's happening in the labour market, more and more people are actually spending more and more of the time and effort to try to win some kind of positional advantage, which takes them further away of developing themselves as individuals, because they're just jumping through more and more hoops. And even our leisure, even our extracurricular activities are now defined in terms of how it contributes to your employability. This doesn't make much sense. It's rational. You can see the rational logic for it, but it doesn't make a lot of sense.
No, it really doesn't. I mean, measuring so much of human life in dollars, essentially, of productivity is horrifying. And yet, my son asked his college roommate who is studying to become a software engineer, he said, "Why are you studying software engineering?" And he just held up his fingers and rubbed them together and said, "Money."
Yeah.
Well, A, he may have been wrong. He may have had, in fact, 2 out of 3 times he was wrong, according to your data. But second of all, that's experiencing life through an incredibly thin straw.
Mm. Mm.
You know what I mean? It's
Yeah.
certainly experiencing education through an incredibly thin straw. In one of your books, The Global Auction, you argued that, in fact, it predates Human Capital as a book. And it sort of set up for Human Capital, the book, by saying, we think maybe the underlying ideas are wrong. But you pointed out that the outsourcing of knowledge work around the world has really amplified the problem of human capital theory. Can you describe that a little bit and how it does that?
One of the key ideas in the global auction was to go and test the assumption that we now were entering a kind of a global knowledge economy where it was assumed in the West, in America, Britain, and Europe, that most of the knowledge work would be done, if you like, by us, and that the emerging economies would be engaged in lower level, more routine, basically manufacturing, which they've been done for a long time, but now service, back office service forms of industry. So we thought, well, if we're going to understand globalization, this was at the end of the 90s, first decade of this century. If we're going to understand this, let's go and talk to the leading players, the large multinational companies, and let's go and talk to some of the governments that are significantly involved in this. So in China and India, and at that time it was possible to do this. So we quickly discovered actually that for China, the multinationals were their schools. They were invited in on the understanding that they would share some of their knowledge and ways of doing things, which would allow them to rapidly modernize. And there was one quotation that I remember, which was, "Today we're the world's factory, tomorrow we're the world's competitor." And that was from about 2004, that quotation. So you basically can see precisely what's happened. So to answer your question, what we quickly recognized is that the emerging economies were rapidly scaling up to be able to not only do the back office work, but increasingly areas of knowledge work. But it was knowledge work where quite a lot of the knowledge had been standardized. So we use the term digital Taylorism. So the idea, like in the early 20th century, the whole rise of mass production was based on the capturing of craft knowledge, converting into assembly line using relatively low-skilled labor. And what we were picking up was the fact that this was now being applied to service areas of work and areas of knowledge work, where that knowledge was being codified and captured and standardized and digitalized, which meant, of course, that it could be then moved anywhere in the world. So when you've got more and more of an educated workforce elsewhere, and you've got this increasing move towards kind of platforms, which enabled, for example, service activity to be safely engaged in any country, you had the beginnings then of an understanding for the companies that they could do much more forms of high skill work for less money. And that was the beginning. So there was early experimentation after 2000. And I don't think the companies really understood. The idea this was all worked out by the companies is not the case. I mean, they were experimenting and then they realized what was available. And then we had the movement from there in terms of its massive expansion of global value chains. And of course, now we're going through the same experimentation again in relation to generative AI, because nobody knows what the outcome of generative AI is. Those companies, the leading companies, don't know what that's likely to be. And so one of the key things for us is to recognize that the technology is not destiny and to try to shape those technologies and the use of those technologies in ways which are beneficial for labor. And that is going to be a huge challenge, I would think.
It's a really interesting phrase that you said. Craft knowledge was essentially captured by capital, which is that it was able to be moved from the minds of craftspeople to the production line, and that the craft knowledge was taken out. And I can absolutely see how AI could do that. So, as you think about replacing human capital theory, what would be the ideal outcome of a revised theory? What would we want to see in the world that a revised approach would deliver?
That's a great question, which is very, very difficult to answer. But what I think it entails is really standing back and thinking again about the purpose of the division of labor. Because actually, the division of labor is not just about creating money and wealth. Most of the things that people do in their jobs, they do for other people. We do it to improve the quality of life in many respects. So the nature of contribution itself needs to be reconsidered in relation to what we would describe as work and what we would describe as then that part of wage work. And I think that that also means that we have to rethink what we're doing and how we understand education. This is very tricky because education is about, obviously, the early socialization of individuals into a society, but it's also about a competition. It's also about who's going to end up with the best credentials in the best position to get into, as we've already described, the best colleges and get the best jobs. And for parents, of course, they're constantly concerned about what the implications of the nature of education are going to be and what that means in the positional competition. But nevertheless, we have to break out of this model of credentializing. We have to break out of a narrow view of disciplined study. We have to really think again about, we talk about lifelong learning. What does that really mean? I mean, certainly in the UK, we've seen a collapse in part-time study at university in terms of numbers. We've seen a very significant decline in the amount of money employers spend on training. Everybody says, how do we respond to AI? I know, we'll have more lifelong learning. And everything points in a completely opposite direction. And lifelong learning is not just about basically 25 onwards. It's from year dot. It's from the beginning of our lives to the end of our lives. So we need to, I think, have a different way of thinking about the purpose of education. And ultimately, we're going to have to think again then about distribution and redistribution. We're going to have to think about who gets what, who does what, and who gets what in this system. Because what we see is increasing evidence, I describe, of productivity capture. And productivity capture is easily described. So if you pick up your mobile phone and think about all the technology that is in that phone and the sources of that technology and the range of involvement in making that technology possible. And then a company can suddenly get created, take all that technology, all that knowledge over decades, if not centuries of industrial development, and call it their own. That it's private. So the benefits of that are private. That's all right, as long as you have lots of opportunities for people to have good quality jobs offering good wages in the economy. The problem we now got with generative AI is that more of human capital, to go back to that term, can be captured by companies through technology. This takes human capital in that sense, or the chance to earn money from a job, out of the economy, because it basically then is captured by the companies and by their shareholders and by senior executives. So we will have to think again about how we understand contribution. Now, this is a long way from where people are at the moment, but nevertheless, I can't see what the new source of mass production is going to be in the sense of labor. Because if you look at historically at industrial revolutions, they've all created new sources of mass employment. This one doesn't. And people will say, oh, well, it's a matter of time and these new jobs will come and we'll be able to sort this out. I hope they're right, but I don't think they are. And we certainly can't plan on the basis that these jobs will arrive, because it will be too late, because we're already seeing very significant unraveling. If you think what's going on think what's going on in France now, think what's been going on in Britain with Brexit, think what's going on in America. These things are not disconnected from what we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, Keynes's whole argument was that democracy depends on the performance of the economy, essentially. And that when the economy falls and fails to satisfy the needs of the people, that authoritarian regimes rise. And he argued it after the First World War. So yeah, these things are not unrelated. So let's talk through what replaces human capital theory. And it starts off with the idea of focusing less on labor scarcity and focusing more on job scarcity. Can you explain that?
The idea of labor scarcity is basically human capital theory. It's the idea that when we invest in our skills and we develop these skills and our knowledge and our experience, that they will have value in the job market for which companies will be willing to pay a premium for, in that sense. So there's a view that labor itself and the skills attached to it is scarce. We could talk about issues around skills gaps, that there might be people available, but they haven't got the right skills. So that would still come under the labor scarcity view. However, the job scarcity view starts the other way around in a way and says, well, education is important. The skills we have is important. Our ability to be able to do certain kinds of work, obviously matters. But nevertheless, the big problem is that the economy is simply not creating enough of the sorts of jobs that anywhere match the education expectations of the workforce. And therefore, the issue goes back to the question, what does the future of work, what will the impact of technologies likely be on the kinds of jobs and the kinds of things, the kinds of tasks that people will engage in? So a job scarcity view is that we are not making good progress in using technologies in order to create meaningful work for a significant proportion of the workforce. Now, this, of course, doesn't mean that there won't be good quality jobs for people, because there are some people. But if we're talking more generally, and this is part of the problem with lots of discussions about technological change, is they always talk at the top end, at the sharp end of where skills may be lacking. Obviously people talk about cybersecurity and many other areas related now to generative AI. Now, they're important, but that's not the economy. So the question then is, how do we begin to respond to the job scarcity? One of the arguments we make is we have to confront companies much more in terms of how they're using and how they're going to use generative AI and other related technologies in the future. Because if they begin with a cost-cutting labor substitution model, then the prospects for the future of work look pretty grim. Because another aspect of that, if we also start from the assumption of a war for talent, and if companies begin by assuming that most of the value is created by the top 20% of their workforce, for instance, then what do you do with the technologies? What do you do with the data that you can generate? You basically are going to try to enhance the power and control of that 20% and the productivity of that 20%. And you'll probably try and substitute and automate and standardize everything else. If you start with a wealth of talent view, where you recognize that all of your workforce can add value, a few may not be, but generally you assume that everybody can add value, then you're going to use those technologies in a different way. You're going to use it for, if you like, cognitive extension rather than cognitive capture. And that is a fundamental battleground. And we've got to make sure is that the kinds of tools that are now on offer to companies are not just about cutting costs of labor. They're about that augmentation of skill and opportunity for the workforce to be more productive. And there isn't a trade-off here with productivity, because it's highly likely that the companies that fully engage their workforce are likely to be the most productive, and especially over time. Because one of the crucial things here, I think this relates to some of your own thinking, I would say, is you can't automate trust. And trust remains an absolutely vital nature of work, and culture and the social aspects of work in a context of generative AI become more important, not less important. You can't run an economy like a banking app. And it's that which we've got to really engage, I think, with companies and identify good cases of where companies are really doing the right thing with their technology. So I think that's something I'm very keen on trying to think more about.
It's very aligned with my thinking, which is that companies need to see themselves as producing two kinds of value. One kind of value is whatever we produce for the traditional customer, and the other kind of value is the kind of value we produce for the people who work at the company. And that's a bidirectional model that thrives, that flourishes when both sides of the model their needs are met. And so I think this tradition of human capital is one that very much assumes that the flow of value is largely one directional, except the flow of money in the opposite direction toward labor. But that there's more to value in work than the money. And so you used the word quality job in the last discussion. What is a quality job?
I think for me, a quality job is a job that has meaning for people. A job that's meaningful, that provides enough to live a decent life within the community in which they live. And a job, I think this is becoming more important, a job that allows space for people and the opportunity to think and to use their capabilities. And I think that's really a pretty important aspect of this, because I think that it's possible that more jobs that are being undertaken by graduates don't get anything like what the individual is capable of and has actually been trained for. So we are, I think, potentially in a situation where education, again, is a compensation for work, that actually education is about a wider sense of preparing somebody to live a meaningful life, that sense of being and becoming that an individual might have, and that sense of individual growth, a large part of which may not come through the workplace, because we simply assume that work has become, because it's so-called knowledge, supposed to be knowledge-based, that it's going to basically keep us fully engaged, fulfilled, and motivated, whereas in reality, that may not be the case for a lot of people. So how can those people therefore live meaningful, fulfilling lives? And is the education system actually helping them to achieve that? I mean, it seems to me that it's not in many respects. And still, we've got far too many students that see the whole thing in credentializing terms, because they still think that with a bit of value added to their CV, that they will be okay and get a good job. But that may not be the case. And sustaining that job, of course, it's not just a question of getting the first one.
Yeah, one of the quotes from your book is, we need to loosen the relationship between learning and earning as the foundation of economic freedom, but also, I think, as the foundation of the value of our lives. There's two other major pillars to the reframe, to the new paradigm. One of the other pillars of the new paradigm that you've proposed is that we should rethink the definition of economic returns, and that we should increasingly look at the social rate of return. What does that look like?
I think what we have in mind there is that the rate of return being at the level of the individual, that individuals invest in themselves, or even that companies will invest in the workforce and the profit from that is theirs. But as mentioned, there is this issue of productivity capture, which means that the top end of the organization can run away with most of the benefits from economic activity of other people. And it's quite interesting to reflect on the fact that despite this huge investment in education and the assumption that that would lead to higher returns to labor, that we see quite the opposite happen, and more concentration of wealth in the hands of very small number of individuals. That's simply not sustainable. So if we think about the ways in which a society creates the context for which wealth can be created by individuals, we are in a situation now where, therefore, the rate of return cannot simply be seen to be, in terms of the company's private domain. I think that we are going to have to rethink that issue, as mentioned, of contribution and of the question around the division of labour, who gets what. And so we're into that thorny area of basic incomes, what that might look like, given their expense, and they are hugely expensive if they're going to be meaningful. How would that then be organised? There's a great danger, in my view, that just a basic income where you're just giving people a sum of money is almost like saying, here's some money, go and live your life, don't bother us anymore. So how do people still have the opportunity to grow as individuals within a society where work may be less of a key part of it? Wage work, that is, not work itself, because work itself is much broader than that. I think that is going to be a big issue. And another issue, which I don't think we should lose sight, is it's possible that a basic income or credit can be attached to social credits. And your social credit, your basic income, will tend on keeping your nose clean, doing the right things. Otherwise, you're going to lose your social credit. And that, I think, is also going to be quite a big issue in relation to basic income. But the biggest one is obviously, how do we afford it? And what kind of new model of distribution are you going to have, which maintains some notion of fairness for those creating that value, but on the other hand, recognizing that without some shift in the way in which we distribute wealth, society is going to struggle to sustain its cohesion because it's already unraveling. And it's going to further unravel if we just allow this to continue as it is, assuming that the market or the technology will resolve our problems, because they won't.
Are there any near-term policy recommendations that come out of this? I know you're starting to explore that, and I know that therefore your thinking in this area is still emerging. But are there any near-term policy recommendations?
I think we're going to have to think again about the purpose of education in relation to just that assumption around human capital. I think one of the biggest problems is that governments are so tied into the idea of that promise of education and returns, the human capital view, that they're trying to prop it up. They're trying to prop up the opportunity bargain. And the more they try and prop it up, the more frustrated people are becoming in their everyday lives. So basically, governments have got to show a lot more courage in saying, look, this model is not working. We understand that. We now want to work through how we can shift that model. And there may be ways to think about doing that, which are difficult for governments at the moment when you think about the problems we've got in the States, and especially in the UK, where there is no money. Most of the money is going on health. So there's very little money to start to experiment, even with things like basic income and what have you, and to reduce the debt burden on students. I think the idea of trying to getting more people going into apprenticeships and using that route rather than going through universities in some ways, that's a good idea, but on one condition, that employers recognize it at the same status as what they currently do when they're recruiting talent. In other words, there's real possibilities for progression. And there's little evidence that employers are really doing that yet, but they could do that. I think there's issues, and I think immediately issues around how technologies are being used and how governments invest in companies in use of new technologies. They should not be given blank checks to that kind of thing. It should be linked to the use of technology which is beneficial to labor. That's, for me, a very important aspect of this. So I think there are certain things that we could be doing now. I've not worked this out because it's still very much work in progress as far as that's concerned. It is for everybody, isn't it? We're all trying to grapple with how we move forward in relation to this.
Yeah, there's a program in California that I need to track down and learn more about. And it's a program that essentially provides companies with the ability to pay people who are new into the economy. So essentially, the California government says, look, we're going to pay for the wages of somebody who comes into your company for a period of time. And it's super successful because it lowers the risk for the employers enormously. And it gives them the ability to bring somebody on at no cost or very little cost. And then that person then starts to be able to learn and engage with the economy in a way that pure education alone can't do. So I have a few closing questions that I ask everybody. And if you've gotten to the end of some of my podcasts, you might have heard it, but you may not have gotten to the end of all my podcasts. One of them is, what job do you hire your job to do for you?
I have heard this one from listening to your podcast. It's a very, very good question. I would have to say that I think I hire my job to do a lot for me, in that I've used work to really create meaningful work for myself, because I've seen what routine, boring jobs are like. So when I started work in British Lane, I was kind of 16. I started work at 7:50 in the morning. Tea break was at 9:15. That sense of time is the same as the sense of time of a day 20 years later. That is a luxury. That's a privilege. The privilege to be able to spend your time in work, thinking and engaging with interesting people and trying to work through fairly complex ideas. That's a real privilege, in the same way that working with students, especially doctoral students and other researchers, and the hundreds of interviews I've done with senior policymakers and corporate executives and things, that again is a huge privilege. So in a sense, I've been very greedy, I think, through my work. I'm greedy in constantly being able to be interested.
It really is a wonderful position to be in. And it comes with a reliable, if not enormous, income that you know can take care of your family. So it's got that, and then it's got this incredible, I'm going to say coal face, but the coal face of understanding and discovery and exploration in the company of people who enjoy the same thing. And so it is privileged, but I also think that way more jobs can produce the same kind of satisfaction beyond, for instance, academia. And so it's a very compelling. In fact, I interviewed, one of the people I spoke to was Jeff Parker, and he's the person who put the math behind multi-sided markets and multi-sided businesses. He's at Dartmouth now. What he found from work was so similar to that. It was so similar. It was discovery of stuff that I'm interested in, the company of friends. What does your work cost you?
Time and attention, in the sense that I think my family members would quite often say, he's here, but he's not with us. He's head somewhere else. I think that's absolutely fair. And I would also say, and it's a criticism of myself, that I perhaps have led my life, my academic life, because I'm coming to the end of it, in terms of being a waged employee. I will carry on writing and doing this work, but that bit is coming to an end. That I've probably lived it too much in a rush, not given myself enough time to reflect and have time for doing other things, I would say. It's absorbed a lot of my time and effort. So that would be a cost. Apart from that, the positives significantly outweigh the negatives. And one thing I haven't mentioned is just how important my co-workers have been and colleagues have been, and people like Hugh Lauder that I've worked with virtually for a lot of my academic life, Sarah Sadiq more recently, and Daniel James, I'm working with at the moment on something called jobgraph.com, which is a new platform we're trying to set up. And we're just experimenting. It's all free at the moment. And we're just trying to experiment because we're trying to think, okay, well, if we apply some of these ideas, say in relation to companies and employees, what does that really look like? What kind of tools could we build to create the sort of data and capacity building for a different future of work? So we're exploring some of those ideas at the moment. So if anybody's interested who's listening, please get in contact with us.
How do people learn more about you and about your work?
I'm fairly easy to find. I'll just by having a name, Phillip Brown, but it's got 2 L's. So I kind of Google search LinkedIn and Google Scholar it.
How many books have you written?
Well, there's a new one going to come out next year, probably about 6, but it's about 18 if you include all the edited collections as well. So quite a lot.
That's right. And so A, no wonder you've been busy. And B, no wonder you don't have time for or interest in social media. That is a big job. And I will actually say you're not that easy to find. And it's because Phillip Brown is not a specific enough name. And so when people look you up, they should also include Cardiff University and the term sociologist. And then you can get there. Oh, you've got a great Wikipedia page, though. And so Phillip Brown, sociologist in Wikipedia is a good place to start. Thank you very much for coming on the show.
No, thank you. It's been a really interesting conversation. So thanks for spending some time to read some of my work.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Work for Humans. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. And share the show with one person you think would get value from it. Believe it or not, this really helps us grow the show and reach more people who want to build the kind of work that people really want. As always, thank you to my producer, Jason Ames at Ninth Path Audio for his insights into content and his high standard for quality. Final note, the opinions shared here are my own and not the views of Google or Cisco Systems. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.